be the place for you to type in your questions that we will choose from and then ask our panelists at the end of the evening for the last half hour of our evening together. You can also chat with each other and to the panelists on the side. Keep in mind that our panelists are focused on discussion amongst themselves and that really it's the last portion of our webinar that's interactive this evening. That being said, I'm going to turn it over to Seneca Johnson, a youth organizer with YUCCA Action.
Hinchte, Estango, Seneca Chaujifkiros, Bushwilgi Amirelegire Omis. So hello everyone, my name is Seneca Johnson. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm from the Muskogee and Seminole Nations. And I'm a steering committee member of YUCCA, or Youth United for Climate Crisis Action. And so before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are all organizing on and honor the Indigenous caretakers of this land that we all live in, because we are living on stolen land. We give thanks to our Tewa relatives and stand in solidarity with our Indigenous hosts. And we would like to give gratitude for lessons that they teach us in kinship, resilience, care for the earth, and care for our communities. Thank you for grounding with us in solidarity. With these teachings in mind, YUCCA stands with the Black Lives Matter movement as they fight against police brutality, institutional racism, and state-sanctioned violence across the country. YUCCA recognizes the importance of this fight, one that spans hundreds of years. And while our focus is on environmental justice intersects with racial justice and economic justice in so many vital ways, and you can't have one without the other. Police brutality and institutional racism is something that we all need to not only stand against, but actively dismantle. And we have to be a part of this because this is all of our fights. And the time is now for us to take a big step forward to protect the futures of Black, Indigenous, and people of color by centering their voices. And so with these principles to guide us, we are proud to have joined Walk the Talk to co-host tonight's event. And so now I'm going to hand it off to tonight's moderator and Walk the Talk organizer, Raz Bandari.
Thank you, Seneca, for that wonderful land acknowledgement. Welcome, everybody, to this panel on why defund the police in New Mexico. So I'll just sort of introduce Walk the Talk and what we do. So Walk the Talk is a community-based initiative based here in Santa Fe with a goal to defund and ultimately abolish the police here in Santa Fe. We organize protests and other events to garner public attention, like so, and we use that attention to reach our political leaders. I would like to give a warm welcome to all of our wonderful panelists today. So thank you all for being here. Your voice is very important, so I'm very honored to be in your presence. So I will go ahead and introduce the panelists, starting with Dr. Melanie Yazzie. So here I have Dr. Melanie Yazzie is a citizen of the Navajo Nation. She is an assistant professor of Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico. She is also cultural desk for the Red Nation, a grassroots Native-run organization committed to the liberation of Indigenous people from colonialization and capitalism. She specializes in Navajo and American Indian history, political ecology, Indigenous feminisms, queer Indigenous studies, and theories of policing and state. Thank you for being here, Dr. Yazzie. Our next panelist is Monique Salhab. Thank you for being here. Monique Salhab is a post 9/11 veteran who became politicized and a community organizer upon returning from war. She served as the interim co-director of the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice, and previously as the interim community and membership director for the local food cooperative. She also is a lifetime member of Veterans for Peace and served on the Veterans for Peace National Board of Directors from 2015 to 2018. Monique is a social justice consultant and a co-founder of RACED, a social justice equity team, actively engaging individuals, community groups, and organizations to deconstruct white supremacist behaviors and culture and patriarchal constructs. Thank you for being here, Monique. Our next panelist is Jeff Proctor. So Jeff Proctor is the editor of the Santa Fe Reporter. Jeff Proctor has been investigating every corner of the New Mexico criminal legal system, including police violence, prosecutorial misconduct, racial profiling, and the criminalization of homelessness. since 2002, when he began his career at the New Mexico Daily Lobo. He's worked at the Albuquerque Journal and KRQE-13, and now makes his home as a contributing editor at the Santa Fe Reporter, the weekly newspaper in the capital, and New Mexico in Depth, a nonprofit digital news organization. Jeff has won some journalism awards and forced some shit to change through his reporting. Pleasure to have you here, Jeff. Our next panelist is Felipe Rodriguez. Felipe was born and grew up next to the ocean in the beautiful port of Acapulco. What is GR? Guerrero? Is that right?
It's Guerrero.
Guerrero, okay. I apologize. He immigrated to the US along with his family in search for security and opportunities. He graduated from the University of New Mexico with a bachelor's in psychology. Felipe started organizing with the UNM Dream Team in 2015 and immediately fell in love with the work of the organization. Felipe is now the campaign manager and co-founder of the statewide network New Mexico Dream Team. He believes in the power of community organizing, intersectionality, and activism to win the fight for immigrant rights and social justice. Nice to have you here, Felipe. Thank you for joining us. So to begin our panel, we do have a central question that we're going to start with. So if any of the panelists would like to answer, please just raise your hand or just send me a message if you in particular feel moved by the question and want to speak. So the first question we're going to start off in our panel will be, so this is sort of directed towards everyone, but especially towards people for Monique, Melanie, Felipe, etc. What do you see the role of police as in the communities that you are a part of, serve, or write about? That's sort of our introductory question that we're going to start with, and then we'll sort of move forward based on that. So go ahead and let that sit in and sort of think about that, or go ahead and speak. What is the role of police in the communities you are a part of, serve, or write about? Go ahead, Monique.
So the way that I look at the police, I actually don't really use that language. I actually use military law enforcement because of how enmeshed, intertwined the military industrial complex has become in our society, and particularly let's look at the state of New Mexico. And you know, the military started out as militias originally to find and round up enslaved Africans. And so as the centuries have moved through, militias evolved into the National Guard and then branched out into what we see now as quote unquote police departments. And so I think the languaging that we utilize around policing, or it needs to shift in that sense of really viscerally starting to, I think, accept that police departments are not police departments and rather militarized law enforcement. You know, in the state of New Mexico, the average salary is about $50,000 to $60,000 for law enforcement officers, spending about $346 million on judicial costs yearly. And the Department of Public Safety has a budget of around $64 million. So the money that is spent on APD, New Mexico State Police, Bernalillo County, and all of the other county law enforcement, militarized police departments, that's money that is being utilized against mainly Black, Brown, Indigenous bodies, imprisoning Black, Brown, Indigenous bodies, and also exerting levels of violence toward immigrant community members and undocumented community members. So I don't look at these departments as having a service in our community at all.
Thank you for that. Dr. Yazzie, I think I saw your hand next.
Yeah, thanks for that, Monique. I think calling cops militarized law enforcement also is an important way to help us understand how cops function to uphold settler colonialism. So in the Red Nation, and then also just who I am as a scholar, right? I do work on policing and reservation border towns. Albuquerque's a border town, as are places like Gallup and Farmington, and Santa Fe, actually, because border towns border Native nations. Of course, they're on stolen land, but they're also on kind of federal trust land and in relationship, and that's why they're called border towns. But the way we talk a lot about policing in these spaces is upholding the settler order, which is basically what we understand as law in the United States, the entire kind of like spectrum of law in a place like the United States. And what that means, the settler order means, so folks who know or maybe don't know about settler colonialism, you know, when it comes to Indigenous people, one of the primary kind of forces or motivations of settler colonialism is the removal of Indigenous people from land in order to gain access to territory and resources. But the removal happens in lots of different ways and is quite complex, especially now that we live in like a fully settler society where the project of the genocide of Indigenous people is considered relatively complete. And so that's about the elimination and the disappearance of Native people. And so let's say in places like Albuquerque, which has almost 400 Indigenous nations represented in its population, 10% of my own nation lives in Albuquerque. This was like a decade ago, according to the census, it's probably higher. There's a lot of Indigenous people, right, in these spaces. We're surrounded by Indigenous land. And so this idea that we're supposed to have been disappeared, that we're, you know, relics of the past within the settler order, the fact that we're very present every day, you can't really go anywhere in a place like Albuquerque without seeing Native people or knowing that you're in Native space creates a crisis, right? It creates a constant kind of threat to the settler order of things. And so police, right, being one of the primary mechanisms of enforcement by the state on behalf of the state, they do the work of enforcing the settler order of Indigenous disappearance, as do vigilantes, right? Militias were initially, that then became police forces, municipal police forces especially, were vigilantes. They were settler militias. We're seeing the resurgence of white supremacist settler militias in this moment. In New Mexico, we've been tangling a lot with them. The Red Nation has, they've been targeting us specifically. And so when we think about policing, we need to think about like police, right? The folks who earn a salary and call themselves, let's say, APD, but we also need to think about the broader spectrum of militarized law enforcement, which includes these vigilantes and these settler militias. And in a place like border towns, there's something, it's called Indian rolling. It's a very specific kind of white supremacist vigilante, usually white and Hispano men participate in this, but it's kind of like the systematic killing or torturing or maiming of Native people in these spaces. And so that Indian rolling functions hand in hand, right, between sort of vigilantes and what we normally think of as police to fulfill and to keep reinforcing the settler order, right, to constantly have to police the crisis of Native presence in a space where we're not supposed to exist, where we're off reservation, right, where cities, we're supposed to be street names, but we're not supposed to be actual human beings. And so kind of in a settler society, this is how policing functions in relationship to Indigenous people, is to constantly clear us out because we're a threat, right, to this narrative that the US likes to tell itself, that the project of settler colonialism and Indigenous disappearance is complete.
Thank you for that, Dr. Yazzie. Would anybody else like to add more to these points? Go ahead, Jeff.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to sort of weigh in from the perspective of a journalist. Just a couple of things that I would like to add, just in the 20 years that I've done this in terms of sort of examining police violence and the way that police function, in particular in communities that don't look like mine. Two things that I've observed sort of overwhelmingly over time. One of those is that the role, which was the question that you raised, the role of police has increasingly become not just to enforce what Dr. Yazzie was talking about in terms of what has evolved into the law. More specifically, the role of police has been to enforce the notion of private property rights. We have seen a huge number of examples, perhaps most infamously in Albuquerque with the shooting death of a homeless man by the name of James Boyd. That entire case is just a sort of really painful example of the way that the police were summoned because there were white folks up in the foothills of Albuquerque who didn't like the fact that there was a homeless man camping near their property. He wasn't even on their property. So that the way that situation ended, I don't think I need to describe for that, describe for anyone here how all of that ended. The other thing I wanted to weigh in on was a few of you have mentioned the notion of militarized policing. And that's something that I have spent a fair bit of energy and investigation exploring in our state. I think most folks equate the idea of militarized policing with equipment. I think a lot of people are familiar with the so-called 1033 program, whereby the United States military has funneled things like Bearcats and Rooks and big, scary Barrett 50 caliber rifles to police departments, which send an incredibly menacing message to a lot of the communities who they are, at least in theory, entrusted with protecting. So there's a message that gets sent through the equipment that we give these police officers. New Mexico has a particular flavor of militarized policing that's different than a lot of other places, and that there has been for a long time here a training program that is run through the US Department of Energy that has trained a number of Albuquerque, Bernalillo County, and state police officers in tactics that were developed for the United States' overseas wars in the Middle East. And I have been able, through the course of some of my reporting over time, to connect a huge number of the police shootings, particularly by the Albuquerque Police Department, to this militarized training. So it's one thing, to give a bunch of overhyped bros toys that they're going to want to use that scare people in the community. It's another to train them in tactics that frankly have no business in even like the notion of an urban law enforcement setting. These are people who have been trained now in courses with titles like Rolling Day-Night Convoy Ambush. So whatever you think of the United States' entanglements and wars and violence perpetrated on people overseas, that has migrated into the police departments here in New Mexico and has resulted in a tremendous amount of violence.
Thank you, Jeff. Felipe, I did see that you had your hand up. Did you want to get a blurb? And then I'll go back to Monique and Dr. Yazzie, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just add that for immigrant communities, while our communities don't experience the same direct violence and brutality that Black folks and Indigenous folks experienced by the police, for immigrant communities, the police has played a role of essentially an extension of ICE. When I came to the US, I became undocumented and was undocumented for 8 years. And I remember my uncle, who had been here for a while, being undocumented. Every time we will drive by an APD car, he will drive really straight. I remember one time we went to the grocery store that we always go to. And when he saw a cop going into the grocery store, he was like, you know what, let's go to another grocery store. And it's because he understood that the police was a connection to ICE, and he has seen, and we have seen in a lot of communities, that people that have been pulled over by police and then called ICE have resulted in deportations, or we have seen the Department of Corrections holding people and waiting for ICE to pick them up. In Albuquerque now we have some protections in this issue. However, it's not the same in the rest of the state. And in the rest of the country, we have seen even programs that make it so that police collaborate, share information, and keep holding people for ICE and facilitate deportation proceedings and the incarceration of immigrants. We have seen, even in Texas, I was part of a campaign that fought against a very draconian law that was passed 3 years ago called SB4, that obligated police officers to act as immigration agents and call eyes on people that they suspected were undocumented, and we know where those suspicions come from. They come based on race. And the bill actually punished officers that wouldn't comply with this. So that is how immigrant communities have understood police, basically as an extension of ICE and immigration enforcement.
Thank you, Felipe. So I'll go to Monique first, and then Dr. Yazzie.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I appreciated Jeff speaking to the training that militarized law enforcement agents receive here in the state of New Mexico, and that training center. I'm not sure if you were talking about Fleet C, Jeff, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which exists here. That's also one of the integral training centers. They train over 100 people within, over 100 individuals within federal agencies, plus local city and state officers throughout the United States. We have one of 4 training centers here in the country that's located in the state of New Mexico. And so, in speaking to the equipment, the idea when I see an MRAP moving down the street, and I think about my experience being in Iraq, knowing what that type of equipment was used for, and then now being transferred to being used on everyday community members, the idea that law enforcement officials have been trained on that, right? That is the purpose. The purpose of law enforcement agents is just what the purpose of the military industrial complex is. And the purpose of that is to kill. That is their only reason to exist. And that is their only mission, so to speak.
Thank you, Monique. Dr. Yazzie?
Sure, I wanted to speak to just 2 things. The first, right, Jeff, what you bring up, that there's you've seen an increasing discourse of policing as the protection of private property, as we've seen not just in New Mexico, but throughout the United States, especially following George Floyd's murder on May 26th. These militias that are coming out into fuller view, their claim is also that they're protecting private property, or these business owners protecting, taking up arms to protect private property. And I think it's important to remember that the notion of private property is a legal construct. It's a legal construct that is actually born out of the liquidation of indigenous land, and therefore the genocide of indigenous people, but then also the commodification of African peoples through the process of enslavement, right? That was also a form of labor, but then that was also a really pivotal form of property, the creation of property in the burgeoning United States at that time. And so we need to understand private property not as like a thing that has always just existed out in the ether, like it's a natural way that we relate to space or stuff or land, but private property is itself an anti-Black, right, and an anti-Indian formation. And so, of course, like police are going to say they're protecting private property, and they're going to claim they're not being racist in that moment. But if we understand private property as a product of colonialism, right, and of racism in this country, then we understand that private property is also just the same kind of militia, the Indian killers who went out to kind of quell indigenous resistance, and those patrols that went out, right, to capture escaped enslaved Africans, for example. So I just wanted to point that out. And one more thing, I really appreciate this conversation about kind of the militarization of law enforcement in New Mexico, because it's like the tanks, right, and it's like the weapons they have, and how you feel and experience policing in New Mexico is hyper militarized. But at the same time, something that folks who've been doing a lot of work on policing over the last 30 or 40 years, sort of during the neoliberal period, you see the rhetoric and like the way that the ideology of policing changes dramatically to where kind of the configuration of the terrorist or the insurgent becomes melded with quote unquote domestic policing, because I don't think they're really all that separate, right? Because if you're using, US war in the Middle East tactics to train quote unquote domestic police forces here, but this idea that every citizen is an enemy, and therefore police are always out, and there's like enemies everywhere, and then just seeing like human beings as permanent enemies or terrorists in that way. This is also like the ideology of policing that has come with the hyper-militarization of policing. And so there's like, that's the worldview of policing these days. And that's partly why they act the way that they do towards people.
Thank you, Dr. Yazzie. Do we have more to say about the militarization of the police force and its effects on our communities here in New Mexico?
I just want to add, I mean, everything that's been said both by Dr. Yazzie and Jeff, that, in addition, we have to look at the numbers of militarized law enforcement who are former active duty personnel, who are now veterans, who are actively being recruited by law enforcement departments to become cops. And so not only are they bringing the training of violence and killing, but also the unfortunate aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder and all of the issues that come with being a combat veteran. And so they're actively moving into that role and using those same type of tactics upon everyday citizens. And when we look at the training that law enforcement are receiving, not only is it in regards to the equipment that they receive through the 1033 program, but we have also seen that their manuals, their training manuals, have now mirrored military training, and the language that was pointed out, the language that they're utilizing now is militaristic.
Thank you. So I was going to ask Felipe, could you give us a little bit more insight on how this whole this militarization sort of overlaps in communities affected by ICE and immigration policies as well?
Yeah, we have seen ICE using the same violent tactics and shooting immigrants while are detaining them, and I think that we have seen also the same incarceration and the same industrial complex being formed in the immigration system with private detention centers for immigrants. The same way that private prisons are profiting out of the bodies of people, the same thing is happening with immigrants that are showing up to the US or immigrants that are being detained inside the US.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add? Because otherwise, go ahead, Dr. Yazzie. Go ahead.
Just one more thing. This is so important. To speak to Felipe's comments about the relationship between ICE and APD and just policing and the militarization of policing. I've been doing a lot of work just over the past month on these militias, like the New Mexico Civil Guard, the New Mexico Patriot. I think Patriots is what they're called. And those militias are populated by cops who are out of uniform, by prison guards, by folks who've worked in ICE detention facilities, by Minutemen who've come up from the border, who've really cut their teeth on policing through the capturing and the detainment of folks crossing the border. And then I think there was one other category. There's also just like gun nuts and white supremacists who are part of that milieu. But you can see, and they've also been called friendlies by the APD to quell the protests that have been happening, let's say just in Albuquerque, for example, over the last 4 or 5 weeks. Some of them are considered Albuquerque Police Department assets as well. This is the language that's used. And so you can just really clearly see the continuum of policing. There are all of these different agencies, and then also people who are just civilians. There's a really close relationship between this whole spectrum of folks who are doing policing. And so when we're thinking about police, we can't just think about like uniformed cops working for the APD, right? Like ICE is cops. Like those Minutemen, they may not be in uniforms, they may be vigilantes or whatever, they're cops, right? And so trying to understand that and to think about policing more broadly, I think is something that I've been trying to work on also.
Thank you. So if it's okay, I'm going to move on to the second major question that's sort of going to be the meat of this conversation, if that's okay with everybody. So my second question, and this is mainly posed to members of the community who are affected by this policing and this militarization. What do you think about the movement to defund the police? And in that question, consider abolition as well. So whoever raises their hand. do you need a minute to kind of collect your thoughts?
I'm ready to go, but I've been taking up a lot of space. So if somebody else wants to speak first, I want you to talk first.
Go ahead, Dr. Yazzie.
Okay, I'm a teacher. This is like my teacher tricks. Trying to get people to talk first. And of course, I'm a teacher, so I'm just used to like talking constantly. I think that the movement to defund police is brilliant. I mean, when we saw this emerging just days after things started popping off in Minneapolis, I think a lot of us who've been trying to do this work for a long time were shocked and overjoyed that what had been taking decades had taken days. I think to get people to a place where defunding police, and now people are talking about defunding the military at a larger level, that was just rolling off the tongues of people you had never expected to. And it's happening at municipal levels. And so I think it's a beautiful development when politics, the temporality of politics and like kind of revolutionary change gets really condensed and a lot of stuff happens in a smaller period of time, especially for folks who've been doing movement work for a long time. So last year, the Red Nation came together where our organization has a ton of different people in it, lots of Indigenous youth. And we sat down and wrote something called the Red Deal, which was kind of a rejoinder to the Green New Deal. And one of the premises of the Red Deal is an abolitionist framework. I think often when people think about abolition, they think about abolishing prisons or abolishing police or abolishing the military, but there's actually two sides to that, right? There's a divest away from these institutions of state violence, but you need to be investing or reinvesting the resources that you get from that divestment into, you know, things like housing and education and public transportation, the things that don't take life, but the things that give life to people. And so we used this framework and this kind of equation of divest and reinvest as like one of the pillars of the Red Nation. And so we created sort of this broad platform about what we would be divesting from. You know, ICE was one of them, police, the US military, addressing US military, US imperialism, and then reinvesting in a whole host of basically programs that like the Black Panthers were calling for decades ago, right? When they were doing abolitionist work. And so this is something that we've been thinking a lot about over the last year in the Red Nation. And then when it just happened in the last month, we were thrilled because we're like, wow, like, you know, this is part of a conversation that we've been having with each other for a long time. One last thing, I do think that this transition or this, right, we're talking about the way in which counterinsurgency techniques on behalf of the project of US imperialism, like has been externalized in the Middle East, for example, right? When we think about war, we think about war happening in like foreign spaces. And then this is a part of like the US project that happens outside the United States. But because of what's been described already about how policing and police are being trained using counterinsurgency tactics that are used in warfare, right? That there's actually a much more fluid relationship between what happens domestically and then what happens in a foreign context. And so when we're talking about defunding police, then we also must be talking about defunding the military. And if anybody knows anything about the US military, you know that the US military is more well-funded than, what is it, like the other 7 next nations combined. They got a 20% increase last year. The APD got a 30% increase in funding last year. And so the military is like, the US military is like the greatest purveyor of violence, hands down, throughout the entire globe. And so what we're experiencing here is also what people are primarily colonized folks are experiencing in places like Latin America, and places like the Middle East, and places like Africa and Asia. And so we need to be having a larger conversation about defunding the military. That's apparently happening right now in Congress, which is kind of wild to me too. But yeah, I see this as really exciting work.
Thank you, that was very well put. Go ahead, Jeff.
There's no way that I'm going to be the first person to respond to any of these questions. That's not happening. I will defer to Dr. Yazzie every time on that. In any case, one thing I wanted to back up a tiny bit. There was one thing that I didn't say sort of related to the first question. And I think this is instructive and meaningful for the broader discussion that we're having here. I think, and it also fits in the defunding piece of the conversation as well. I think there are a lot of people who sort of consider themselves either part of the Blue Lives Matter movement or like supporters of the police or what have you, who don't understand that the police are the most visceral way that most people in this country ever experience state power, right? So there are plenty of folks who will go on their Facebook pages and scream and holler and yell about Peter Strzok sending a text message to Lisa Page as part of this massive deep state conspiracy, and that is the expression of state power. Yet at the same time, it just doesn't occur to them that when you get pulled over in a traffic stop, right, that that is the ultimate expression of state power. Someone who has control over your body, particularly, once again, if you don't look like me, who has control over your body, who has a weapon, and who is guarded and shielded by the doctrine of qualified immunity if they decide to use force against me. So I think that's an important thing for people to remember, that most folks never experience anything that has anything to do with the CIA or the so-called deep state. Almost all of us at one time or another are going to have some sort of an interaction with a law enforcement officer. That is the ultimate and most visceral and most ground level expression of state power in this country. So just getting past that, I wanted to get that out because it was sort of hot on my brain pan. The defund conversation, one thing that I want to frame that up a little bit from my perspective as someone who has covered police departments, police budgets, and elections, mayoral elections, gubernatorial elections, county commission elections. And the conversation has always been framed around a lack, a shortage. You hear the notion of a police officer shortage come out of literally every politician's mouth who's ever existed in this state. I have written a number of stories that have attempted to sort of examine that narrative from a different click around the kaleidoscope. When you look at the notion of how many police officers a municipality or a county or a state should have, there are so-called best practices around that. It's important to know where those best practices come from. They come from the big law enforcement think tanks, the Police Executive Research Forum, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Those are all union-driven and union-funded organizations. So what ultimately does a police union need? They need money. How do they get money? Through dues. How do they get dues? Through increased membership. So that's all. It's a backwards conversation around how many, if you believe we should have police, and I'll respectfully defer to the other panelists on abolition, but in terms of how many police officers we should have, if one believes there should be police officers, the conversation is not how many cops should we have per 100,000 residents, it's how are the cops we've already got apportioned. So the massive problem that I have seen and reported on and exposed through the years comes through the notion of so-called proactive policing. Proactive policing is a very bad idea. It's manifested in things like broken windows policing, which lots of folks are familiar with, the notion that if you cut off crime at the low level where somebody's tagging a wall in a park, then that person's not going to become the murderer of tomorrow. It's a bullshit concept. Stop and frisk is another thing that was born of the notion of so-called proactive policing. So for me, the question has always been, what do we want from the police? And if, again, you're someone who believes there should be police, most folks want to be able to call a number when the shit hits the fan, have somebody respond quickly and act professionally and constitutionally when they show up. And that's it. Anything beyond that, a SWAT team, a pawn shop detail, a white collar crimes unit, a criminal intelligence unit in a police department. And we all saw how that worked with the NYPD and the mosque crawling that went on. Anything that starts to stretch into so-called proactive policing has never worked for most communities in America. So the framing of the conversation around how much money should they get, should a fifth of the city of Albuquerque's budget be dedicated to the Albuquerque Police Department, I think there's a good argument, a good faith argument to be made that that's not right. Most of that budget is spent on so-called proactive policing, which has resulted in discriminatory practices, selective enforcement of the law, and law enforcement itself being carried out on Black and brown folks. So I think that's an important thing to remember, this idea that we have to have 1,000 cops in Albuquerque or 1,100 cops in Albuquerque. And you hear that from everyone who's run for office here for as long as you could possibly remember. It's sort of the wrong conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. Monique, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Yazzie for mentioning and naming the piece around the military-industrial complex and defunding. And I just wanted to share a quick slide, if folks don't mind. So when we talk about defunding the police, we have to recognize that these are the elements that make up the military-industrial complex. Junior ROTC programs and ROTC programs in universities, the militia, National Guard, white supremacy groups, prison industrial complex, military law enforcement agencies, and DHS, which houses 22 agencies under it alone. And so if we're just using language that specifically talks about defunding the police, then we are not recognizing that there are plenty of other systems, established systems under the military-industrial complex to take its place. And so the broader piece has to be about what would defunding the military-industrial complex actually look like, right? Which is a much more complicated question and issue to tackle. And especially in the state of New Mexico, where, we here in the state itself, there's such an entrenchment of the military-industrial complex alone. And the fact, like, for example, the Department of Homeland Security spends $1.7 billion alone in the county of Bernalillo, $1.7 billion. That is just Bernalillo County alone. So to think about, what Jeff mentioned about the budget of the Albuquerque Police Department and the budget of Department of Homeland Securities, right? It goes to like looking at what $1.7 billion could actually do in regards to the state of New Mexico, to social programs and health education programs and healthcare and things of that nature. And so it goes back to the language that we are utilizing and looking at, the spending that happens here within the state of New Mexico. I mean, an average New Mexican resident contributes, I should say rather, an average of $1,500 into defense spending just in this state, because of the entrenchment that New Mexico has, whether it's federal contracting, whether it's the military bases that we have here, and all of the other pieces that connect us basically to the industrial complex that exists. And so, we have to look at what would New Mexico's economy look like if the state would defund from the military-industrial complex? And lawmakers and decision makers and the politicians that exist in these pieces don't want to actively talk about that. And so it's easy to keep the conversation on strictly defunding of police or talking about community to policing, the fake program that the mayor rolled out in regards to coming up with, a community policing program to somehow parallel, active community engagement, right? Versus looking at let's reallocate funds from the department itself into actually making a successful program that truly isn't about policing, period. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you for that. So I saw Felipe's hand first, and then we'll go back to you, Dr. Yazzie. Is that okay? Go ahead, Felipe.
Yeah, I have two thoughts with the funding the police, and a lot of it is expanding on what folks have mentioned. So thank you so much for speaking on some of these things. I think with the funding the police, I've seen, like Monique said, I've seen a lot of reactions from people in power, from leaders, building this department, moving the budget around, building this other thing. And I think we need to be critical of all of those attempts because we might end up in the same situation that we're now. And I think people need to, maybe for the first time in our lives, listen rather than act. And if we listen to the movement to defund the police and the movement for Black lives, it's very clear. It's defund the police. This institution is not working. This institution is killing us. Get rid of it and invest in social program for communities and other things. So I think we need to be very critical of all the moves that are being made in our cities, in our counties, and really push for what people are truly demanding. I think also I'm really grateful of folks talking about the broad picture and Monique framing it in the military-industrial complex because from being critical of the funding of police, I think it needs to encompass what you all mentioned, and it needs to encompass the enforcement that immigration enforcement and immigration detention. That has to be part of it. And the New Mexico Dream Team has been doing work around that in New Mexico, and that is what I'm the most familiar with. New Mexico actually is also investing in immigration enforcement in a big way. We have 3 immigrant detention centers, one in Otero County, one in Torres County, one in Cibola County. These are being made out of the contracts between the counties and ICE, and they subcontract with private corporations to manage these detention centers. But the county is willingly giving their space and their facilities to ICE to house immigrants that, like I said, are showing up to our border or are being detained from our communities. This has been sold for many years as revenue and as way of sustaining the economy of New Mexico, which is one of the poorest states in the US, and sustaining the lives of people that live in those counties. However, we have been finding that that is not true. We published a report a couple of years ago that showed that the Cibola County is losing more than $2 million every year from maintaining their private detention center from expenses that neither ICE or CoreCivic are compensating. And this is just the private immigration facility. There's other facilities, another iJustice that they're working with that they're probably losing money from too. If you see at the employment, this is bringing very little employment. And a lot of times these jobs are not even filled because people don't want to work in an inhumane industry like detention. We're actually pushing people into having to work in a horrible place like a detention center to be able to survive. Most importantly, now in the COVID health crisis, we have seen that these companies don't have very much regard for the safety of people inside detention. And we have seen terrible outbreaks in the 3 detention centers that we have. We got a letter that MTC, Management Training Corporation, this is the company that manages the Otero immigrant facility and also the Otero private prison, and they contract with the Otero County. They sent a letter saying that they are gonna have to cancel the contract unless the number of detainees increases, because they're low on profits. And this was happening at the same time that Otero was reporting more than 200 positive cases, an outbreak that was completely out of control in the facility, and the first death in the facility. And so we're being sold this story, and New Mexicans are being sold this story that these companies are helping communities, but in fact, they're twisting the arm of Otero County and other communities, putting people at risk, not only inside the facility, but also in the communities around, and putting at risk the people that work there. So our state or counties are consciously and deliberately investing in immigration enforcement by signing these contracts and collaborating with ICE and with these companies, when in reality we could be investing in other things, like also social services and other industries for those communities to be able to thrive.
So go ahead, Dr. Yazzie, but right after your question, I will be asking the final question because I'm just keeping track of time, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, cool, thanks. Monique, thank you for reframing, and all of you for really being critical of the defund police kind of call and the way that politicians in particular responding to it, and reminding us that it's actually the full spectrum of the military industrial complex. And then in a place like New Mexico, even the nuclear industry is part of the military, is an essential, an indispensable part of the rise of the US superpower that we now understand as the modern military industrial complex, US imperialism. And so something that we also tried to address in the Red Deal, I'm just going back to the Red Deal because we put a lot of effort into kind of the abolitionist vision of the Red Deal, is that I think often when we think about abolition, we think about kind of freeing and helping human beings, right, through social services. And so this is part of the third question: what do we want to spend that money or reallocate funds to if we're divesting away from the military industrial complex? But in a place like New Mexico, and especially for Indigenous people, we actually have to reinvest in like healing the earth and the land too, because of course the nuclear industrial complex, was all about extracting uranium from tribal lands and then creating incredible violence and pollution in those communities and against the land itself. And so I think the way that we've been thinking about abolition, a lot of people talk about the relationship, for example, of abolition and decolonization. I'm not entirely sure they're mutually exclusive, but I think this conversation about defunding the military industrial complex in New Mexico would be also a form of decolonizing the land and getting resource extraction, which is one of the major purveyors of violence against Native people in a place like New Mexico. And so it covers, I think, the broad spectrum of state violence and tackles settler colonialism in addition to anti-Blackness, right? And these other things I think we often associate with the political project of abolition. So it also accomplishes decolonization for not just Native people, but for the land and other folks as well. So thank you so much for reframing it.
Thank you, Dr. Yazzie. Okay, so since we're kind of running low on time, I'm going to ask this final question. So if you could limit your response to at least 90 seconds, just so we can kind of get to the Q&A because we got some great questions coming in. So our final question, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit. I've heard you guys sort of talk about it. How would you like to see the police budgets otherwise allocated and spent in New Mexico? How would divestment sort of look?
I'll try to keep it short. I think divestment, quite frankly, it really would have to come from a strong push from not only organizations throughout the state of New Mexico, but if we were to talk specifically, for Albuquerque as an example, it would have to be a strong push from organizations. But the thing is that, politicians are not convinced in regards to divesting from what they believe the military industrial complex contributes to the state of New Mexico. There's been this long narrative that somehow the state of New Mexico would not be able to survive without the military bases and the government contracts. And as Dr. Yazzie mentioned, the nuclear industrial complex that it has existed here for decades. And so it's really about, again, the language and really looking at shifting the viewpoint of how people look at quote unquote law enforcement and the language around that, and really accepting that the military industrial complex needs to be dismantled within the state itself.
Thank you for that.
I can just
Anybody
read the
else?
list of areas that we listed for reinvestment. All right. All right. We're going to heal our bodies through citizenship and equal rights for everyone, free and sustainable housing for everyone, free education for everyone, free healthcare for everyone, free and accessible public transportation for everyone, suicide prevention, non-carceral mental health services, healthy and abundant food for everyone, clean water and air, sexual and domestic violence services, ending murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, reproductive justice services, and then we're going to heal our planet through clean and sustainable energy, traditional and sustainable agriculture, land, water, air, and animal restoration, the protection and restoration of sacred sites, multi-species caretaking, and then the enforcement of treaty rights and other agreements. So those would be the areas that we would reinvest in. All the things.
Thank you, Dr. Yazzie. Go ahead, Felipe. Did I see your hand?
Yeah, I think, again, part of divesting and enforcement is going to be divesting from private prisons and private immigrant detention centers. We're actually the state with the highest dependency to this industry of detention. And so I think we have an opportunity on our state. I think it's pretty clear now, and COVID-19 has helped make it very clear how inhumane these industries are. Not good for people in detention, obviously, but also not good for New Mexicans, and not good for the economy of New Mexico. And so I think we have a chance of start limiting these industries. I think we can start by ensuring that none more contracts with any private prison or private detention centers are being made, and prevent other counties in New Mexico from entering in this really toxic relationship that is having a contract with one of these companies. And then shutting down each one of these facilities that we have in New Mexico, so that we're able to invest in things that are actually healthy for our community. I think that that'll take a little more time. I think it'll take working with the communities where this is happening, and really ensuring that we have a clear plan for an alternative to invest in. However, I think our state can be active in right now start prohibiting any expansion of this industry. The industry has been expanding in our state over the past 10 years, and I can just anticipate that they will keep trying to do so.
Thank you, Felipe. Jeff, I think I saw your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really briefly, Felipe has said a whole bunch of things about MTC and the relationship the state has with private prisons. And he mentioned that letter that MTC sent to the Otero County Board of Commissioners. I just want to give everybody a heads up to keep an eye on my byline. I have that letter too. I will be writing something very soon about what's happening between Otero County and MTC. So that's something I'm really super interested in exploring going forward. But in terms of the divestment thing, this might be a very slightly unpopular opinion. I will say that over the course of my career on reporting on law enforcement, I've obviously gotten to know a lot of cops, a lot of police officers. There are a lot of them who, despite the system that they're working in and its many failures, believe that they're doing something that's good for the place that they live. And one of the things I want to say about alternatives or solutions, which is the question I think that you're asking, what has happened is that the cowardice of elected and appointed leaders in our state and around this country to address the actual ills that have made our communities sick has resulted in them foisting all of these problems off onto the so-called police. And one of the problems there is that when you are a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. These appointed and elected officials have sent the police to solve problems that they are unwilling to try to address in the more difficult and painful ways that are required to make our communities less sick. So I think that in terms of what a solution might look like, or how you might reallocate some of the massive wealth that we have to spend on some of these problems, might start there. We might look at what the real problems are and try to address those in a way that doesn't involve a badge, a uniform, a gun, and a bunch of really gnarly military style training up in the East Mountains.
Thank you, Jeff. So if it's okay with everyone, unless you have something else to add, are we okay with moving on to the Q&A? Okay, awesome. So our first question is from somebody named Gail Wasserman. The question is, do we know what most people in minority, indigenous, and other marginalized communities actually want from the police? Do they want no police, or do they want better police, police that are respectful and protective?
I'm sort of like Dr. Yazzie. I feel like I've been taking a lot of space. Thanks for the question, Gail. And I would just request that when we talk about language, if we could utilize Black, Indigenous, people of color instead of the word minority, and what that connotates on so many levels. And so I think, you know, speaking as a queer Black woman and a veteran, I think what we have seen over these last weeks in regards to, as a result rather, of the death of George Floyd and so many Black bodies, including trans and queer bodies, is we are hearing what Black, Indigenous, people of color, bodied people want. That is very clear. So I think the question is, do we want to actually honor and respect what those communities, what our communities are asking? Do we have politicians, so to speak, who are ready to actually step up and throw away the book of doing status quo and actually respect these communities and do what's necessary? And in addition, you know, I want to add that it's very easy, right? When we look at the colonization, the white supremacy structure and patriarchy that this country was founded on. I mean, we look at race. Race did not become a word. It was not utilized and constructed until the Virginia codes. And so therefore, we've been sold on this idea of race and sold on the idea that, you know, us versus them, and that somehow Black, Indigenous, brown bodies are taking something away from white-bodied people. And so, you know, that idea of separateness is what continues to perpetuate and foster this hate and violence that we see. And in addition, it's scary when you think about the work that we have to do as a queer Black woman. I have to look at how I show up and exhibit white-bodied supremacy, whether it's through language, behavior, thought processes. And so, you know, I can speak to having been 10 years in the military and 2 tours in Iraq, that I believed and drank the Kool-Aid. I believed that what I was doing was right until I was deployed to Iraq and I actually saw what I was a part of and what the quote unquote lie the military sells. And so, you know, policing, that word policing, you know, that is something that has been fabricated and sold as something that we somehow need in our society, in our communities, versus community and mutual aid projects, right? Mutual aid has existed for centuries. We have seen it in so many forms in Black, Brown, Indigenous communities. And so those mutual aids are about caretaking community, are about feeding community, are about educating community, about taking care of children, about helping those who may have intellectual challenges. So the word policing, to kind of wrap it up, I mean, for Gail, I would ask that, it goes back to whether or not those in power want to respect and honor what we've been seeing communities ask for in these last weeks.
Thank you, Monique. That was very well said. Does anybody else have anything to add to the question?
I'll just add, like Monique said, we have been sold for centuries the idea of enforcement and police, and people of color and our community members are susceptible to that. And sometimes you'll find people that have internalized that. And at some point, I also believe that police was necessary and function in our society. But if part of our role as organizers is to facilitate conversations, to be educators, and to give the space to create a space for people to be critical of the police and enforcement. And at least for me, every time that we have created that space and people have the chance of being critical of what the police is, they live with the not wanting the police anymore. And so even though immigrant communities, Black folks, Indigenous folks sometimes will internalize the need of police, if we just take the time to be critical of it, we'll see that it's really not in our favor to have the police.
Thank you, Felipe. Go ahead, Dr. Yazzie.
Yeah, just to build off of, I love everything that y'all have said already, but I don't think, Monique, you said this is like the will of the people. This uprising we have seen have the constant waves. This is people speaking. This is particularly Black folks. This is Indigenous folks. Our Black relatives being the tip of the spear in terms of really forcing us to enact revolutionary change. That's pretty much always been the case in the history, in American history. And so this is what we're seeing. And I think, it's not a coincidence that this is also happening because of the pandemic either. Everybody knows that, my nation and then like Native communities in New Mexico are some of the hardest hit communities by COVID-19 in the entire world. And that's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. Our pre-existing condition is colonialism, okay? And it's like the pre-existing condition is also anti-Black racism. It's also US imperialism, right? Those are the pre-existing conditions. And so what people are seeing, what everyday people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, migrant communities, refugee communities, poor working class white folks are seeing is utter abandonment by the state. And when we're talking about caretaking, right? The state does, and not the state's ever word going to caretake, everyone can be critical of the state, but there's absolutely no mechanism for caretaking, which is why mutual aid networks have had to arise, because the state has completely abandoned people. It's why so many people have died in the United States. That's why the United States is the hotspot in the entire world for COVID-19. And so folks are realizing, right, at a really visceral level, unemployment's almost at 50% right now, that the suffering that we're experiencing is because of the abandonment of the state. It's because so many of the resources that we put into the state go into mechanisms of violence, whether it's the US military, whether it's police, it's the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex isn't about caretaking people, right? It's about killing people. It's about enforcing the project of like global capitalism that exploits people and extracts value from people like Black and Indigenous folks. And so what we're seeing here is an uprising against this abandonment and this general kind of culture of death, I think, the way that the state looks at Black, Indigenous folks, people of color, migrant and refugee communities. And so if you're asking I'm not really sure if like Navajo people would prefer better police or no police. All I know is that they are very conscious and have a really strong analysis of what's wrong right now. And we're in a moment where, as Felipe said, we need to listen to the people, because this is really a people's movement from what I can tell. It wasn't like an organized uprising. This was an organic insurrection of working class, poor, brown, indigenous people of color. And so we need to just be listening to what they're saying. And they're saying really radical, revolutionary things. And so that is where we should be taking our direction from in this moment. The rest of these kind of semantics and these, I don't know, like the solution-based talk, I'm not quite sure we're there yet. We need to be doing a lot more listening.
Thank you, Dr. Yazzie. Anybody else? Otherwise, I have to move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question comes from David Cooper. And the question is, how is the use of force related to the absence of consent? How do we make the use of force obsolete? Go ahead, Jeff.
I said I wasn't going to go first, but I'll take a swing at that one. I think that question, by the way, is not divorced from the previous question. It's a question about wanting police or not, or any of the rest. And it seems to me that the conversation probably starts way before whether, again, communities that don't look like mine want the police or they don't. I think ultimately when we're having conversations about people wanting to live together, to have a society, there is some sort of a notion in every group of people who've ever tried to live together of right and wrong. It seems like the reimagining needs to happen there. And if there's a conversation about what people want from each other and want from themselves, then there can be a conversation about enforcing those things and how that might look. Where we are right now, it's really difficult to have a conversation around whether there should be police or not, because there is so much scar tissue that exists here around the definitions of right and wrong. But in terms of the use of force and how it is related to the absence of consent, it's almost always in the context of absence of consent. There are a million different ways that you can put standard operating procedures on police officers that they have to announce before they use force. One of the huge problems there is that there are no consequences when they don't. So that's an issue around consent when it comes to the use of force, and making it obsolete. I think that's a much bigger question about peace and harmony. But one of the huge problems that we have is that even when they set up these regulations for themselves, or when we set up laws for how police officers can and can't use force, there are no consequences, number one, for violating those rules or those laws. And another problem, and I want to mention this because it's very specific to Santa Fe. In the context of the Santa Fe Police Department, people who live in that city do not even have occasion to know whether the police department believes that in a particular use of force that the officer has broken the rules. And that's because the Santa Fe Police Department believes that it's none of your business when a police officer has been disciplined. This is a fight that we've been after for a super long time at the Santa Fe Reporter. We're in the middle of active litigation against the department. It's their contention that when a cop gets disciplined for violating the department's rules, that's a matter of opinion, and it's therefore exempt from public disclosure. So if you back it all the way up to that, if we don't even know how they're judging themselves against their own rules, it's really, really difficult to have a conversation about consent in the context of use of force. So I think transparency is a really, really key thing here in any conversation around what we want to do with the police.
Thank you, Jeff. Does anybody else have anything to add with regards to this question? Okay, so am I? Oh, go ahead, Dr. Yazzie. I just saw your hand.
I just raised it. See, you're moving on. Sorry. I feel like the two operative words in that question are force and consent. And whenever I think about consent, I automatically think about the feminist politics around consent. And that makes me think about gender and heteropatriarchy. And this isn't terribly concrete, right, in terms of how do we engage in abolition in really concrete ways. But there's a reason why like 80% of cops are men, like cis hetero men. You're going to talk about consent and the continuum of force that is related specifically to heteropatriarchy and how that works through force as one of its primary expressions, both as a function of the state, but then also like in our individual and our family lives, then we really need to be talking about gender and heteropatriarchy when we're thinking about how do we abolish force and just coercion, I think, as something that animates our everyday lives. So again, that's not super helpful, but that's just what comes to mind and I think needs to be addressed. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Anybody else? Otherwise, I have to move on to the next question. Go ahead, Monique. You're muted, just so you know.
Sorry, just one quick thing. And, thinking about use of force, I automatically think about rules of engagement that's utilized within the military construct, right? And the history of that and how, again, that has, basically use of force has been mirrored off of rules of engagement. And so a lot of it is very mirrored. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question is from an anonymous attendee. How can we hold our politicians accountable to help defund the police? Instead of holding them accountable, should we help more people who reflect BIPOC points of views to run for office instead?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. So the question is, how can we hold our politicians accountable to help defund police? Instead of holding them accountable, should we help more people who reflect BIPOC points of views to run for office instead? And I think, Felipe, I did see your hand first.
Yeah, I think both of those are valid strategies to move this forwards, but I don't think they can be isolated strategies, right? We cannot just push elected officials. We need to get more people in those positions of power. But we also need to engage in a public narrative strategy that starts changing how people are perceiving enforcement and policing. We need to engage in a policy strategy that puts forward policies that gets us closer to these demands. And we need to engage in an organizing strategy where we are building relationships with people who want this similar change and increasing the power of that we can collectively have. I don't think just by electing people of color that will be in these systems that are not made for us. We're setting them up to fail, right? If we elect someone into office, even if they have all the intentions, they're not gonna be able to defund the police just because of the way it's set up. If we're holding our elected officials feet to the fire, there's only so far that we can get by that, and without changing the structure of our legislature and our government and the role of government. So I think it's always a combination. It's never bad to support someone that reflects his values to get into office, but it cannot just be the only thing. And it's never bad to hold people accountable and make calls to offices I think it'll always help, but it cannot be an isolated strategy. We need to combine all of these strategies and really create a movement in New Mexico to defund the police and defund enforcement.
Thank you, Felipe. Go ahead, Dr. Yazzie.
You can also just call me Melanie if you want to. Dr. Yazzie is so formal. So I think engaging in electoral politics is important. It's an important tactic, but something that the Red Nation strongly believes and follows is that we actually need to take our guidance from movements, and that building a strong movement will require people in power to follow the direction of movements if your movement is persuasive and large enough that forces the hand of politicians to make concessions, but that our energies should be going into maybe talking about the reallocation question, reallocating in like grassroots organizations or like service providers and not politicians and their campaigns, because those are the folks who are already doing the caretaking work and the work of building the movement. And so trying to think about how movements guide elections rather than putting all of our energies and resources directly into elections. And so one is, these are different strategies, I think, but it's not to dispose completely of electoral politics. A lot of kind of radical political tendencies just completely eschew electoral politics as anything important. I think it's quite important, but it's how we engage that, not necessarily directly, but we build our own movement so politicians are forced to follow. And I would say at least the state and the local level, the Red Nation has had quite a bit of success in that particular way of engaging with political figures and folks getting elected who then kind of represent those interests. But yeah.
Thank you, Melanie. Does anybody else have something to add to the question? Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I will say about my profession, about journalism kind of broadly, is one thing that we can do better collectively and sort of as a force in whatever the country is, in terms of accountability, is to make sure that whether it's elected officials or appointed officials or sub-cabinet level appointees in an administration, or also kind of the folks who are speaking on behalf of movements, is to make sure that the rhetoric matches the action. Monique had mentioned earlier in response to one of the original three questions, this program that the Keller administration plans to roll out, or says they plan to roll out, that would create a different kind of response to mental health calls. I and some of my colleagues are working on a story. That plan so far is so thin. It has absolutely nothing behind it so far, and really no plan, no money, how that replaces police. So if you've got something like that, this is something that myself and people who've been in journalism for a really long time call kind of the old narrative hack. So if this is what you're going to come out and say, it seems like sort of a passive aggressive nod toward folks who are advocating for defunding, abolition, or whatever it is. But instead of using those words, the same words that are bubbling up from movements, you get this, oh, we're going to create this whole complete new thing to respond to mental health calls. So I think that journalism and journalists need to make sure that when somebody rolls something out that's that potentially radical, it's great that he's gotten a ton of really positive ink in the Washington Post around that, and that he'll sit down and speak with a Washington Post reporter for 20 minutes about that. It's our job here in New Mexico as reporters who are writing for audiences who live in this state to make sure that we get the same time, because we can ask different questions, better questions, questions that are more informed by people who live here, questions that are more informed by movements that have generated from here than a Washington Post reporter can, to make sure that the rhetoric matches the action and that he means what he says. So I think that's, in terms of the accountability bit for politicians or for anybody else who wants to jump into this pool and participate in this debate about how we go forward, the rhetoric should match the actions, and it's journalism's job to make sure that happens.
Thank you, Jeff. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next question? Okay, so this will be our final question for the night because we are kind of running out of time. So this is from an anonymous attendee, and the question is, how do we have the community be involved? Sign petitions, make a bill? Just want to be more involved besides just learning.
Join an organization. There's 3 amazing organizations in this panel, community organizations that you can be part of. For the Dream Team, I will say to follow us in social media and take action when we call people to action.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Just one little plug again. Grab a camera, a notebook, and a pen, document, and find a platform to publish.
Go ahead, Monique.
I think those are great ideas. I would also add that it's important for all of us, and you know, I think it's important that white-bodied individuals not only show up physically, but also that can also turn into performative action. I think it's important that internal work be done, meaning to look at how we embody white supremacy, patriarchy behavior and language and thought processes, because we can have all of the best systems which exist to dismantle and defund, but if we are not also paralleling that with our own internal work, then we repeat those same behavioral patterns that we are looking at wanting to deconstruct. And so I find that in doing the external, we also have to do the internal.
Thank you, Monique. That was very well put. Dr. Yazzie, and then we will have to wrap up. Go.
I see we have 1 minute. Yeah, I can't stress enough, join an organization that's already doing this work. We all need capacity. If you can't join, give us money or resources. I mean, I'm not even gonna sugarcoat that. Like, that's just what needs to happen. We don't have billions of dollars behind what we're doing. We're literally trying to change the world. So give us your money. If you can't give us your support through actual labor. I would say that at street actions specifically, because they're gonna continue to happen throughout the summer, show up and, as Jeff said, bring a camera and bring like a notepad and act like a reporter in that situation. If you don't feel comfortable being a protester, we need people cop watching at these actions. Because, like, for example, when Stephen Baca shot Scott Williams Monday a couple of weeks ago, it was because people were cop watching the New Mexico Civil Guard and Stephen Baca, that there's evidence that they can use, right, to build that case. We need people documenting how APD is interacting with people. So if that's a skill that you have, then you need to show up to actions, whether that's happening. And yeah, I think that's all I had to offer. Help
Thank
us,
you.
please, in a meaningful, material way.
Thank you, Melanie. And Monique, you had one quick thing you said.
Just one quick thing. I want to point out that that we have across this country, we have hundreds of National Guardsmen and military members who are standing down. I feel like it's important to state that because I recognize that it's not publicly known. But you know, we through GI Rights Hotline, it's an 800 number that National Guardsmen and active duty personnel can call. Veterans like myself are there to answer and to support. So I just want to put that out there and let people know that there are military members who are standing down.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are coming to a close of our conversation, which I thought was, for a first panel, I am very honored to be in the presence of all of you. Just one quick thing before we end off, I would like to take this moment to raise awareness of the fundraiser that YUCCA is hosting right now for Black-led nonprofits, building power for Black New Mexico and the All African People's Revolutionary Party. who are both doing beautiful, necessary work around defunding the police, the community, sorry, defunding and the police, and working to invest in the community. So YUCCA will be matching every donation up to $5,000. So every dollar you put in will be doubled. We've just put the link in the Zoom and Facebook chat. So I would love to thank you all for being here. It was an honor. Again, I think this was a great conversation. I feel like I learned a lot. And I think it was amazing to have you all here.
Thanks for having us.
Also, Melanie just put something in the chat.
I should have done it earlier, sorry.
It's okay. So the rednation.org, there's a link in there on how you can support the Red Nation.